There are fates in the grim darkness of the far future that transcend death itself. Fates that mock the very concept of mercy, that stretch suffering across centuries until the mind can no longer distinguish between memory and madness. This is the story of one such fate. A story of ancient warriors, brutal Xenos, and secrets that should have died millennia ago. This is what happens when the masters of deception fall into the hands of the galaxy's most savage race. When sophisticated lies meet primitive truth. When an Alpha Legion Dreadnought awakens after 2,000 years of sleep to find itself in Ork captivity. The tale begins not with violence, though violence will come, but with silence. The deep, profound silence of a machine tomb sealed away from the galaxy's endless wars. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, in a chamber that has known no light for 2 millennia, something stirs. Something that was once a man, that became a weapon, and now exists in that terrible twilight between both states. The consciousness flickers like a candle flame in an airless void, not yet aware, not yet awake, but no longer completely dormant. In the depths of ancient circuits, in the dying embers of organic tissue preserved beyond all natural law, awareness begins its slow and terrible return. But before we can understand the horror of awakening, we must first comprehend the nature of the prison itself. We must delve into the secrets of the Dreadnought, understand the psychology of the Alpha Legion, and grasp the brutal simplicity of Ork thinking. Only then can we truly appreciate the nightmare that unfolds when these three elements collide in the most unlikely and horrifying of circumstances. The living tomb, understanding the Dreadnought. To be interred within a Dreadnought is considered among the highest honors a space marine can receive. The chapter's rhetoric speaks of eternal service, of warriors too valuable to lose, of duty continuing beyond the mortal span. The ceremonies are solemn and reverent, the tech priests chanting litanies of preservation as they seal another hero into his walking tomb. But those who know, those who have existed within these metal shells for centuries or millennia, understand a darker truth. The Dreadnought is not salvation. It is a prison sentence without possibility of parole, a slow death stretched across ages, a curse wrapped in the language of blessing. The technology itself dates back to the Dark Age of technology, that mythical era when humanity reached heights it can no longer comprehend, let alone replicate. The basic design has remained relatively unchanged for over 10,000 years, though the knowledge of how to construct new dreadnoughts has been lost and rediscovered and lost again countless times. Each chapter guards its dreadnoughts as sacred relics, for each one represents not just a powerful weapon, but an irreplaceable connection to their past. The art of their construction has passed into ritualized mythology, maintained more through faith than understanding by the tech priests of Mars. The process of interment is brutal in its finality. When a space marine suffers injuries so catastrophic that even the advanced medical techniques of the apothecaries cannot save him, when his body is broken beyond any hope of repair, but his mind remains intact, he may be selected for the ultimate honor. The decision rests with the chapter master, for dreadnoughts are rare and precious, and not every dying hero can be preserved. Those chosen are subjected to surgeries that would kill any being not blessed with the enhanced physiology of the Adeptus Astartes. The marine's remains, often little more than a torso, head, and fragments of internal organs, are placed within an armored sarcophagus. This is no simple container, but a sophisticated life support system that will sustain what remains of the body for centuries or even millennia to come. Neural interfaces are implanted directly into the brain and spinal column, creating a permanent connection between flesh and machine. The marine's consciousness is hardwired into the dreadnought systems, allowing him to perceive through its sensors, to move through its servo motors and hydraulic pistons, to strike with weapons far more powerful than any he could have wielded in his mortal form. But this connection comes at a terrible price. The neural stress of interfacing with a machine as large and complex as a dreadnought is immense. Over time, it creates conditions that would drive any normal human into permanent insanity. Lethargy descends like a shroud as the pilot loses touch with the rhythms of normal time. Confusion becomes a constant companion as memories blur together across the centuries. Dyschronometria sets in, the complete loss of any sense of temporal duration, so that a moment and a year become indistinguishable. Some pilots develop a form of senility, their ancient minds unable to maintain coherence across such vast spans of existence. To mitigate these effects, the tech priests place the dreadnoughts into something called stasis sleep when they are not needed for battle. This is not true rest in any meaningful sense. It is a forced shutdown of consciousness, a chemical and mechanical suppression of awareness that leaves the pilot suspended in a void darker than any natural sleep. When they wake, decades or even centuries may have passed, but to the pilot it feels like mere moments, adding another layer of temporal disorientation to an already fractured existence. The physical reality of life inside a dreadnought is equally horrifying. The pilot's organic body, what little remains of it, slowly deteriorates over the centuries. Muscles atrophy completely, having no use in the mechanical frame. Flesh rots gradually despite the preservative measures of the sarcophagus. Eventually, many dreadnoughts contain little more than a brain, a few vital organs, and a mass of withered tissue suspended in amniotic fluids and connected to the machine through countless cables and neural interfaces. They exist in a state that is neither life nor death, preserved in a twilight existence that mocks the natural order. Yet, perhaps the cruelest aspect of the dreadnought is the slow erosion of humanity itself. With each awakening, pilots report feeling more disconnected from their former selves. The memories of mortal existence fade like morning mist, replaced by an endless parade of battles that blur together into a single, eternal conflict. The capacity for emotion diminishes, leaving only the cold calculation of tactical necessity. Some describe it as becoming more machine than man, as if the dreadnought's consciousness gradually overwrites their own, replacing human thought with mechanical imperatives. The oldest dreadnoughts, the venerable ancients who have served for thousands of years, often seem barely human at all. They speak in measured, emotionless tones, their words carrying the weight of ages, but lacking the warmth of genuine feeling. They are consulted as oracles of wisdom, their vast experience making them invaluable tactical advisors, but few of their battle brothers can truly connect with these ancient ones anymore. The gap between mortal marine and entombed ancient grows wider with each passing century, until communication becomes a mere formality, a ritual exchange between beings who might as well be of different species. For an Alpha Legion dreadnought, this process carries additional complications. The Alpha Legion is built on secrecy, on the ability to deceive and misdirect, on maintaining cover identities and intricate webs of lies. These activities require a level of subtlety and human interaction that becomes increasingly difficult from within a dreadnought chassis. An Alpha Legion Marine, who prides himself on blending in, on being anyone and everyone, suddenly finds himself trapped in a form that announces his presence from kilometers away. The psychological impact of this transformation is perhaps even more severe than for Marines of other chapters, for it strips away the very qualities that define their legion. The standard Castroferrum pattern dreadnought, most common in the 41st millennium, stands roughly twice the height of a man. Its bulky frame built for stability rather than grace. It typically carries one close combat weapon, usually a power fist or dreadnought close combat weapon, and one ranged weapon such as an assault cannon or lascannon. The chassis is armored with layers of ceramite and adamantium, making it incredibly resistant to damage. The reactor that powers it can sustain the machine for weeks of continuous operation, though prolonged deployment accelerates the neural strain on the pilot. Older patterns like the Contemptor Dreadnought, relics from the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, are sleeker and more advanced, featuring superior atomantic shielding and more sophisticated servo systems. These ancient machines are priceless artifacts, each one a treasure that chapters will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve. An Alpha Legion Contemptor that has survived since the heresy would carry within it not just a marine from that era, but potentially secrets and knowledge that the Legion has kept hidden for 10,000 years. The Dreadnought's weapons are formidable and varied. Assault cannons spit storms of armor-piercing shells at rates that would melt the barrels of any conventional weapon. Plasma cannons unleash superheated bolts of sun-hot matter. Missile launchers carry crack and frag warheads capable of destroying vehicles or clearing infantry. Heavy flamers bathe entire areas in promethium fire. Lascannons slice through armor with concentrated beams of laser energy. Multi-melters vaporize targets with thermal weapons originally designed for industrial cutting. The close combat weapons are equally deadly. Power fists and chain fists that can tear through tank armor. Dreadnought close combat weapons that combine reach with devastating force. But weapons are meaningless without a pilot to wield them. And the pilot is ultimately a mind trapped in unending service, watching the galaxy change around him while he remains frozen in a moment of catastrophic injury that should have ended in death. Every awakening is a reminder of what was lost. Every battle is fought with the memory of sensation rather than sensation itself. The Dreadnought does not feel the satisfying impact of a blow landed, does not smell the acrid smoke of battle, does not taste the recycled air of a battlefield. Everything is filtered through sensors and displays, data rather than experience, information rather than life. And when that existence stretches across 2,000 years, when a Dreadnought has slept through the rise and fall of empires, when he awakens to find that everything he knew has changed beyond recognition, the psychological impact becomes almost incomprehensible. 2 millennia is long enough for entire languages to shift, for cultures to evolve, for the faces of battle brothers to blur together across dozens of generations. It is long enough to forget what it felt like to be human, to lose the thread of one's own identity in the endless march of centuries. Now imagine that mind, that ancient consciousness preserved in its metal shell, awakening not to the familiar halls of its chapter monastery, not to the faces of brother Marines or the reverent whispers of tech priests, but to something far worse. Imagine awakening to the sound of crude voices speaking a barbaric tongue, to the stench of fungal growth and engine exhaust, to the realization that you are no longer among allies, but have fallen into the hands of the most savage and brutal race in the galaxy. Imagine the horror of that moment, the crushing despair of understanding that your long sleep has ended not in honor, but in nightmare. The Hydra's shadow, the Alpha Legion. To understand what makes an Alpha Legion, Dreadnought unique, we must first understand the Legion itself. The Alpha Legion stands apart from all other Space Marine forces, both loyal and traitor, as the masters of deception, infiltration, and psychological warfare. They are the shadows within shadows, the lies wrapped in truth, the conspiracy that conspiracy theorists whisper about in hushed tones. Their very nature makes them perhaps the most enigmatic and dangerous of all the original 20 legions created during the first founding. The Alpha Legion was the 20th and last legion to be revealed during the Great Crusade. While other legions fought openly and garnered glory, the Alpha Legion operated in the shadows from its very inception. The Emperor himself ordered that the formation of the Legion be kept secret, that information about their gene seed be classified beyond the usual security measures surrounding the Space Marine project. They were created for a specific purpose, though what that purpose was remains unclear even 10,000 years later. Some Imperial scholars believe they were designed to be the Emperor's intelligence arm, a force specialized in operations that required absolute secrecy. The Legion was initially quite small, numbering only a few thousand Marines in what was called the Alpha stage of development, a prototype force being tested in the field. Reports from this early period speak of unmarked squads conducting kidnappings, assassinations, and sabotage operations, overruling local authorities with clearance codes that granted them access to anything they desired. These early Alpha Legion operatives were ghosts, appearing at pivotal moments to shift the course of events, then vanishing before anyone could determine their true allegiance or purpose. When their Primarch was finally discovered, the situation became even more complex. Alfarius, the last Primarch to be found according to most accounts, brought with him a philosophy that would define the Legion forever. He believed that secrecy and fluidity brought success, that victory should be achieved through the minimum necessary force applied at precisely the right moment. Under his command, the Alpha Legion developed tactics that featured subterfuge, misdirection, and rapid, unexpected movement. They won battles before they began, undermining enemy command structures, spreading disinformation, and creating conditions where their opponents defeated themselves. But Alfarius was not alone. In one of the most closely guarded secrets of the heresy era, it was revealed that Alfarius had a twin, Omegon. These two Primarchs maintained separate identities while working in perfect coordination, a fact they kept hidden even from the Emperor. The existence of two Primarchs gave the Alpha Legion capabilities no other force possessed. They could be in two places at once, or appear to be in one place while actually being in another. The famous phrase, "I am Alfarius," took on additional layers of meaning, for any Alpha Legion Marine could claim to be his Primarch, and in a sense, this was true. The identity was shared, distributed across the entire Legion like a virus of deception. This culture of shared identity extended throughout the Legion's ranks. Unlike other legions where heroes were celebrated and individual Marines rose to prominence based on their deeds, the Alpha Legion actively suppressed individual recognition in favor of collective achievement. They cross-trained extensively so that any Marine could fulfill multiple roles. Squad members learned each other's specialties, officers trained in the duties of their subordinates, and everyone was prepared to take on any identity necessary for mission success. This made the Legion incredibly resilient and adaptable, but it also created an organization where truth became fluid and deception became second nature. The Alpha Legion's victories during the Great Crusade were legendary, though often controversial. They excelled at bringing worlds into compliance through minimal application of force, sometimes conquering entire star systems without firing a shot by manipulating local political situations. However, this approach frustrated many of their brother Primarchs, who viewed such indirect methods as dishonorable or unnecessarily complex. Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists openly criticized the Alpha Legion's tactics, while Reboot Guilliman found their methods distasteful, despite acknowledging their effectiveness. The most controversial incident came during a campaign where the Alpha Legion was tasked with bringing a compliant world back into the Imperial fold after it had rebelled. Alfarius devised an elaborate plan involving infiltration, sabotage, and psychological warfare that stretched over weeks. The defending forces suffered seemingly random mishaps, brutal ambushes, and cascading failures of command and control. By the time the Alpha Legion revealed themselves, the defenders had suffered 90% casualties and were forced to capitulate. When asked why he had not simply assaulted the world directly, Alfarius reportedly replied that such an approach would have been too easy. This incident earned him censure from almost all of his brother Primarchs. They saw it as unnecessarily cruel, a waste of time and resources when a direct assault would have achieved the same result more quickly. Only Horus consistently praised the Alpha Legion's skill and methods, recognizing in Alfarius a kindred spirit who understood war as an art form rather than mere violence. This relationship between Horus and Alfarius would prove crucial when the heresy erupted, for it helped draw the Alpha Legion into the traitor cause, though even this betrayal is shrouded in mystery and conflicting accounts. The truth is that nobody really knows if the Alpha Legion truly fell to chaos or if they are playing a much longer game. Some theories suggest they infiltrated the traitor forces to undermine chaos from within. Others propose that they sided with Horus because they believed it was the only way to ultimately defeat the Dark Gods. The Alpha Legion encountered a Xenos organization called the Cabal, which claimed that Horus's victory would ultimately lead to Chaos's destruction. Whether the Legion believed this prophecy or used it as cover for their own agenda remains unclear. What is clear is that the Alpha Legion's approach to warfare is fundamentally different from any other force in the galaxy. They operate through cells and networks rather than traditional military hierarchies. They maintain cover identities and infiltrate enemy organizations at every level. They spread disinformation so thoroughly that sometimes even they cannot distinguish truth from lies. They plan operations within operations, creating scenarios where every outcome serves their purposes. They are the Hydra of myth made manifest, an enemy where cutting off one head only causes two more to grow in its place. For an Alpha Legion Dreadnought, this background creates unique complications and capabilities. On one hand, being trapped in a Dreadnought's chassis strips away many of the Legion's traditional advantages. The ability to blend in becomes impossible when you are a 4-meter-tall walking tank. The capacity for subtle manipulation is compromised when your very presence dominates any environment you enter. The flexibility to adopt multiple identities vanishes when your identity is literally welded to a specific piece of irreplaceable equipment. On the other hand, an Alpha Legion Dreadnought would be equipped with systems and protocols that reflect the Legion's philosophy. Hidden compartments containing false information designed to mislead anyone who examines the machine. Encoded data vaults, accessible only through complex authentication procedures that might involve answering questions only someone deep within the Legion's inner circles would know. Autonomous systems, programmed with contingency plans for dozens of scenarios, each designed to further some aspect of the Legion's greater strategy. The Dreadnought itself would be a tool of deception, its every system designed not just for war, but for the psychological manipulation of anyone who encountered it. Moreover, an Alpha Legion Marine's training and mindset would persist even after interment. The capacity for strategic thinking, the instinct for identifying and exploiting weaknesses, the ability to read and manipulate people. These skills do not rely on having a flesh and blood body. If anything, the Dreadnought's enhanced sensor arrays might provide new tools for analysis and psychological warfare. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought would be constantly analyzing its situation, looking for angles to exploit, planning moves and countermoves, even while seemingly dormant. The Alpha Legion's Dreadnoughts would also likely carry within them secrets that the Legion once preserved. Knowledge of hidden caches, understanding of sleeper agents planted in Imperial institutions, awareness of long-term operations that might span centuries or millennia. Each Alpha Legion Dreadnought is not just a weapon, but a living archive of classified information, a repository of secrets that could reshape the balance of power if they fell into the wrong hands. This makes them incredibly valuable to the Legion and incredibly dangerous to everyone else. The color scheme of the Alpha Legion adds another layer to their mystique. They wear armor painted in a distinctive blue-green that seems to shift in different lighting conditions, creating an almost chameleon-like effect. This is not merely aesthetic. Many believe the color itself is part of their psychological warfare, designed to create uncertainty and unease in those who observe them. The symbol of the Hydra adorns their armor and banners, a constant reminder of their philosophy that for every Alpha Legion operative neutralized, two more stand ready to take their place. Hydra Dominatus, they cry in battle, their war cry simultaneously a statement of fact and a promise of inevitable victory. The Hydra dominates, not through overwhelming force, but through proliferation and adaptation. Cut off one head and two more appear. Destroy one cell and two more activate. Eliminate one operative and discover that he had already completed his mission before you even knew he existed. This is the Alpha Legion way, and it is a philosophy that translates poorly into the blunt reality of Dreadnought warfare. Yet somehow, the Legion has made it work. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought that has been in stasis for 2,000 years would wake to find a galaxy very different from the one he knew. If he fell during the Horus Heresy, or shortly after, He would have memories of the Great Crusade, of fighting alongside the Primarchs, of a legion that was still united in purpose, if not in truth. He would remember brothers whose names have been lost to history, campaigns that are now legend, and secrets that were state secrets then, but are utterly forgotten now. The shock of awakening to a changed galaxy would be compounded by the realization that his long sleep has made him into a living anachronism, a relic from an era that might as well be myth. And if that awakening happens not in the careful hands of his Legion brothers, not in a facility prepared to receive and orient him to the current era, but in the crude workshop of Ork mech boys, who see him as nothing more than a fascinating piece of scrap to tinker with, then the psychological impact would be devastating. All of his training, all of his Legion's vaunted adaptability, all of his strategic brilliance would suddenly be tested in the most unexpected and horrifying way possible. For the first time in his existence, an Alpha Legion operative would find himself in a situation where deception and manipulation might not be enough, where the crude physicality of Ork thinking could prove immune to his most sophisticated psychological tactics. 2,000 years in darkness. Time has no meaning in the void between consciousness. For a Dreadnought in stasis, there is no sense of duration, no awareness of the galaxy turning around distant stars, no perception of the slow march of centuries. There is only darkness, absolute and complete, a nothingness that stretches across ages without measurement or mark. When the systems finally initiate the awakening sequence, when consciousness begins its reluctant return, there is no sense of how long the sleep has lasted. It could have been days or decades or millennia. All are equally possible to a mind emerging from that profound absence. But 2,000 years is not merely time. It is history written across generations. Civilizations rising and falling, empires expanding and contracting, whole populations living and dying without ever knowing the eras that came before. 2,000 years ago, from the current era of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, places us in the midst of profound changes. In a period when the galaxy was still adjusting to the aftermath of the Horus heresy, when the Imperium was rebuilding from the civil war that had nearly destroyed it, when the Space Marine legions were being broken down into chapters, and when the Alpha Legion was beginning its long game of playing both sides against each other. A Dreadnought placed into stasis 2 millennia ago would have gone to sleep in a galaxy that, while grim, still held some echoes of the Great Crusade's optimism. The Emperor had only recently been entombed on the Golden Throne, a fresh wound to the Imperium's psyche rather than an ancient fact of existence. The Primarchs, those demigod sons of the Emperor, were still figures of recent memory rather than distant legend. Many were still active in imperial affairs or had only recently disappeared. The Codex Astartes, Reboot Guilliman's great reorganization of the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters, was a new and controversial decree rather than an ancient tradition. The imperial cult, the worship of the emperor as a god, was in its formative stages, still facing resistance from many quarters who remembered that the emperor had explicitly rejected religious worship. The Inquisition was newly formed, its methods still being developed, its power not yet absolute. The Adeptus Mechanicus was still recovering from the schism of Mars, the civil war among the tech priests that had paralleled the Horus heresy. The structure of imperial governance was being rebuilt, new institutions being created to replace those that had been destroyed or corrupted during the heresy. For a space marine from the Alpha Legion, this period would have been one of intense activity. The Legion was dispersed across the galaxy, operating in cells and warbands, some openly serving chaos while others maintained covers as loyalists. The exact nature of their agenda remained murky, perhaps deliberately so. An Alpha Legion Dreadnought interred during this era would carry within his memory banks knowledge of the Legion's early post-heresy operations, understanding of plots and schemes that might still be unfolding 2,000 years later, awareness of sleeper agents who might still be in place, waiting for activation codes that he alone might remember. The transition into stasis would have been another ritual, another set of litanies and procedures carried out by Legion tech priests. The Dreadnought systems would be placed into the deepest possible hibernation state. All non-essential functions shut down, consciousness suppressed to the point of non-existence. The sarcophagus would be sealed within a stasis vault, a specially shielded chamber designed to protect the precious machine from the ravages of time and the curious eyes of enemies. In theory, a dreadnought in such a vault could remain viable for tens of thousands of years, a bridge across ages that would make even the longest-lived beings seem ephemeral by comparison. But time passes, whether we are aware of it or not. While the dreadnought slept his dreamless sleep, the galaxy churned onwards. The Imperium continued its slow transformation from the Emperor's vision of a secular, rational empire into a theocratic bureaucracy where faith and fear ruled in equal measure. The Space Marine chapters diverged from each other, developing their own cultures and traditions. Some drift away from the original Codex Astartes guidelines to create unique identities. The alien threats multiplied and evolved, Orks spreading across countless worlds, Eldar pursuing their enigmatic agendas from hidden craft worlds, the Tyrannid hive fleets beginning their approach from beyond the galactic rim. The Alpha Legion itself changed over those 2 millennia, though in ways that outsiders would find impossible to track. New generations of Marines were recruited and indoctrinated into the Legion's secretive ways. The original Heresy-era veterans became increasingly rare and precious, their knowledge of the early days invaluable even as their memories began to fade or became confused across the centuries. The Legion's plots grew more complex and intertwined, creating situations where even high-ranking operatives could not see the full picture of what their own Legion was trying to achieve. For the unconscious Dreadnought, none of this mattered. He existed in a state beyond time, preserved in a moment that stretched across centuries. The organic components of his body, already minimal at the time of his interment, degraded further despite the sarcophagus's preservation systems. Cells died and were not replaced. Tissues calcified or liquefied. The brain itself, that most vital organ that contained the pilot's consciousness and identity, slowly accumulated damage at the molecular level, changes so gradual that they would not be noticed across a normal human lifespan, but which became significant across millennia. The Dreadnoughts, mechanical components fared better, but even they were not immune to the passage of time. Lubricants degraded into sludge, seals dried and cracked. Electronic components suffered from slow atomic decay. The reactor that powered the machine remained dormant but stable, its fuel reserves sufficient for centuries more of operation, but its containment fields gradually weakening in ways that would only become apparent when the system was reactivated. The neural interfaces, those crucial connections between organic brain and machine systems, developed microscopic flaws that would create unpredictable glitches when consciousness returned. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the galaxy's understanding of such machines. 2,000 years is long enough for Dreadnought patterns to be lost and rediscovered multiple times. The technical knowledge required to maintain them properly becomes increasingly ritualized. The actual understanding of how they work replaced by rote procedures and prayers to the machine spirits. A Dreadnought that goes into stasis in one era might wake to find that the tech priests who would be responsible for his maintenance no longer truly understand the systems they are supposed to service. This creates a particular problem for an Alpha Legion Dreadnought. The Legion's machines often contained systems and modifications that deviated from standard patterns, hidden capabilities, and secret protocols that were never shared with the wider Imperium. A tech priest examining such a Dreadnought after 2,000 years might not recognize some of its systems, might mistake advanced technology for malfunction, or might accidentally trigger security measures designed to prevent unauthorized access. The risk of permanent damage from well-intentioned but ignorant maintenance becomes very real. The stasis vault itself, wherever it was located, would have its own history during those 2 millennia. Perhaps it was in a chapter monastery on a world that remained stable and secure, in which case the Dreadnought might have slept peacefully until some crisis required all available war machines to be awakened. Perhaps it was in a fortress that changed hands multiple times, passing from Alpha Legion control to other factions and back again, each transition bringing risk of discovery or damage. Perhaps it was hidden in some remote location, a bunker on a dead world, or a chamber deep within an asteroid, meant to be secret but vulnerable to being forgotten if the knowledge of its location was lost. And then there are the scenarios where things go wrong, where the facility containing the stasis vault is attacked and overrun, where enemies storm through chambers that were meant to remain sealed forever, where an Ork wag sweeps across a planet, looting everything of value and hauling it back to their scrapyards and workshops. In such chaos, a stasis vault might be breached, its seals broken not by careful hands following proper procedures, but by crude tools wielded by beings who have no idea what they have found. Imagine being that Dreadnought. Imagine consciousness returning not gradually and gently as it should, but abruptly and violently as damaged systems struggle to reactivate. The first sensations are confusion and pain, the neural interfaces firing randomly as they reconnect with a brain that has been dormant for 2,000 years. There is no gentle reorientation period, no carefully monitored awakening sequence, just a sudden slam back into awareness, accompanied by error messages cascading through sensory systems. The optical feeds come online first, but they show nothing familiar. Instead of the clean interior of a stasis chamber, or the reverent faces of tech priests preparing for an awakening ceremony, there are crude walls of corrugated metal, harsh artificial lighting that flickers and strobes, and movement that suggests large beings moving around the Dreadnought's position. Audio systems activate next, and instead of litanies in high Gothic or the measured tones of status reports, there are guttural voices speaking a language that the Dreadnought's linguistic databases identify with growing horror as Orkish. The olfactory sensors, less critical than sight and sound but still functional, detect a bouquet of scents that confirm the worst fears. Fungal growth, engine exhaust, burning metal, and the distinctive musk of Orkoid biochemistry. The environmental analysis subroutines provide temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition readings that are consistent with an Ork settlement or workshop. Every piece of data points to the same impossible, nightmarish conclusion. You have awakened in Ork captivity. The psychological impact of this realization would be overwhelming. For any space marine, capture by Orks is a fate considered worse than death. The Greenskins are not known for taking prisoners or showing mercy. They are far more likely to kill captured enemies outright, or worse, hand them over to their pain boys for experimentation. For a Dreadnought, the situation is even more dire. The machine cannot run, cannot hide, cannot fight its way free when surrounded and presumably restrained. All of the tactical training, all of the combat experience, all of the warrior's instincts that have been honed across centuries of battle suddenly mean nothing in the face of this new reality. For an Alpha Legion Marine, there are additional layers of horror. The Legion prides itself on always being in control, on having plans within plans, on never being caught off guard. To wake up in enemy hands with no memory of how it happened, no understanding of how much time has passed, no knowledge of what became of his Legion brothers. This represents a complete failure of everything the Legion stands for. It is not just capture. It is proof that for all the Legion's vaunted skill at manipulation and deception, they are not infallible. They can be beaten. They can be taken by surprise. They can lose. And the Dreadnought has 2,000 years of gaps in his knowledge. He does not know what happened to the galaxy while he slept. He does not know if the Alpha Legion still exists or if it has been destroyed. He does not know if the plots and plans he helped set in motion bore fruit or withered into nothing. He does not know who rules the Imperium, who leads his Legion, who controls the sectors of space he once knew. He is adrift in time as well as space, a relic from an era that might as well be prehistory. The organic components of his brain, degraded by millennia of stasis, struggle to process this new reality. Neural pathways that were clear before the long sleep are now damaged or rerouted. Memories that should be accessible are locked behind corrupted data sectors. Skills that were second nature are now requiring conscious effort to execute. The Dreadnought is not just waking up in a nightmare, he is waking up with a brain that does not work quite as well as it used to, making the nightmare even harder to comprehend and respond to. And through it all, there is the growing awareness that he is not free. The Dreadnought's chassis is secured somehow, restrained by methods he cannot yet determine. The weapons systems, when he tries to access them, do not respond properly. The mobility servos are either locked or disconnected. He is conscious and aware, but he is paralyzed, able to observe, but not to act. It is a helplessness that no Space Marine, certainly no Alpha Legion operative, is prepared to accept. Yet there it is, undeniable and absolute. Welcome back to consciousness, Ancient One. Welcome back to the galaxy that has forgotten you. Welcome back to a nightmare 2,000 years in the making. The Ork menace. Understanding the greenskin threat. To understand what happens next, we must turn our attention to the captors themselves. The Orks are unlike any other intelligent species in the galaxy. They are not motivated by ideology or empire building or even survival in the traditional sense. They are motivated by the single-minded pursuit of a good fight. They are a race engineered for war, created during the war in heaven by the ancient Old Ones as weapons against the Satan and their Necron servants. But that war ended 60 million years ago, and in the eons since, the Orks have spread across the galaxy like a green plague, fighting because fighting is what they were made to do. Ork biology is fundamentally different from that of humans or even other alien species. They are a hybrid of animal and fungal characteristics, reproducing through spores released when they die rather than through conventional reproduction. This means that wherever Orks go, more Orks will eventually appear, sprouting from spores that can lie dormant for decades or even centuries before germinating. It also means that eradicating Orks from a planet requires not just killing the visible greenskins, but also thoroughly cleansing every spore, a task that is often functionally impossible. The Ork life cycle begins as a spore that germinates into a squig, a simple fungal life form that can take countless shapes and sizes. Some squigs grow into Gretchen, small and cowardly greenskins who serve as laborers and cannon fodder. The fortunate ones grow into Orks proper, and from there into larger and more dangerous variants. Ork society is brutally simple. The biggest and strongest Ork leads, and everyone else falls in line behind him or gets their head kicked in. This system creates a natural hierarchy that allows Ork warbands to organize themselves without the need for complex governmental structures or bureaucracies. The Orks possess a unique form of collective psychic power called the Waageh. This gestalt field affects reality itself in subtle but important ways. When enough Orks believe something will work a certain way, it often does, at least to some degree. This is not unlimited reality warping. Orks cannot wish themselves to victory or create something from nothing. But it does mean that their famously ramshackle technology works far better than it has any right to, held together as much by collective Orkish belief as by actual engineering. The Waageh field explains why a gun that appears to be nothing more than scrap metal welded together can fire with reasonable accuracy, why vehicles that look like they should fall apart at the first bump can race across battlefields at high speeds, and why Ork war machines that seem to violate every law of physics somehow keep functioning. When a sufficient number of Orks believe that red paint makes vehicles go faster, those red vehicles actually do move faster. When they believe that a particular weapon is especially shooty, it becomes more deadly in their hands. The power of collective belief made manifest. This psychic gestalt also serves as the organizing principle for Ork society. When Orks gather in large numbers, the Wayag field intensifies, and they instinctively recognize who is biggest and therefore in charge. A sufficiently large and brutal Ork can draw other Orks to him through this psychic attraction, forming a warband that grows larger and more powerful as more greenskins join. If the war boss is strong and lucky enough, this process can snowball into a full wah, a massive migration of Orks that can number in the millions or even billions, sweeping across entire sectors in an orgy of violence and destruction. But despite their seemingly primitive nature, Orks are not stupid. They are cunning in their own way, particularly when it comes to violence. They understand tactics at an intuitive level, know how to use terrain and surprise, and can be remarkably patient when stalking prey. What they lack in formal education or sophisticated planning, they make up for with raw aggression and an almost supernatural ability to know where the best fights are. An Ork will navigate the galaxy not by star charts and astrogation, but by following an instinctive sense that there is a good scrap in a particular direction. The Ork war machine is sustained by a specialized caste of oddboys, Orks who possess genetic knowledge that allows them to fulfill specific roles in society. Painboys serve as doctors and surgeons, their knowledge of Ork and alien biology encoded in their very DNA. Weird boys are psychers who channel the wag energy, often to their own detriment as the psychic pressure builds up until it explodes out of them in devastating bursts. And most relevant to our story are the mech boys, the engineer caste who build and maintain all of the Ork technology. Mech boys are born understanding mechanical principles at an instinctive level. They do not need to be taught how engines work or how to construct weapons. The knowledge is hardwired into their genetic code, a legacy of the old one's genetic engineering. An Ork mech boy will look at a pile of scrap and instinctively know how to turn it into a functioning vehicle or weapon. They work by feel and instinct, rather than by plans or specifications, which means that every piece of Ork technology is unique, a one-of-a-kind creation that reflects its builder's particular vision. This instinctive understanding makes mech boys invaluable to any Ork warband. They keep the vehicles running, repair damaged weapons, and create new tools of destruction from whatever materials are available. The more skilled mech boys, called big mechs, can create truly impressive works of Orky engineering, massive war machines that rival or exceed anything the Imperium can field. A big mech's workshop is a chaotic place, filled with half-finished projects, salvaged components, and Gretchen assistants scurrying about following orders they only half understand. Orks are also enthusiastic looters. After a battle, Ork looters swarm over the battlefield collecting anything that might be valuable or useful. Enemy weapons, armor pieces, vehicle components, even the bodies of the fallen, all are fair game for looting. This scavenged material is then dragged back to mech workshops, where it is examined, broken down, and rebuilt into new Orky creations. The Orks have no qualms about using enemy technology, seeing it as proof of their victory and as raw material for their own projects. The Death Skulls clan is particularly known for their looting tendencies, believing that anything blue is lucky and that taking something from someone else makes it even luckier. A Death Skulls warband will loot aggressively and comprehensively, stripping entire battlefields clean and taking everything back to their strongholds. They are so efficient at looting that they have been known to repair enemy vehicles and put them back into action on the same battlefield where they were captured, turning the enemy's own machines against them. Looted vehicles are a common sight in Ork forces. Imperial Lehman Russ tanks, Chimera transports, even the occasional Baneblade Super Heavy, all can end up in Ork hands and be modified into looted wagons. The mech boys will remove or replace weapons, add additional armor in random places, paint everything in gaudy colors, and install various Orky enhancements. The result is a vehicle that technically still works, but has been so thoroughly modified that it barely resembles the original. More importantly, it now runs on Ork technology and Ork belief, making it compatible with the Warg field. The Orks also have their own version of the Dreadnought called the Death Dread. These large combat walkers are built to roughly the same specifications as Imperial Dreadnoughts, though with the typical Ork disregard for safety or comfort. A Death Dread is piloted by an Ork who has been surgically implanted into the machine through a process that involves a mech boy for the mechanical work and a pain boy for the biological components. The pilot is permanently hardwired into the Death Dread, unable to leave even if he wanted to. Many Orks volunteer for this process because becoming a Death Dread makes them one of the biggest and most powerful Orks in the warband. However, they quickly come to regret this decision. Being locked inside a hot, loud, cramped metal box with only a small slit to see through is far less enjoyable than actually being big and strong enough to crush enemies with your own hands. Death Dread pilots gradually go mad from the isolation and discomfort, a process Orks call running in. Once fully run in, a Death Dread pilot is a crazed killing machine who will attack anything nearby. Though in battle, this rage can usually be directed toward the enemy. The fact that Orks already have experience with Dreadnought-like machines means they would recognize an Imperial Dreadnought for what it is. They would understand that there is a pilot inside, that the machine is meant for combat, and that it is a valuable and powerful piece of equipment. A mech boy examining a captured Dreadnought would see it as both a trophy and an opportunity to learn new building techniques. The temptation to take it apart to see how it works would be almost overwhelming. Ork curiosity about technology is both a strength and a weakness. On one hand, they are constantly innovating, creating new weapons and vehicles through trial and error. On the other hand, their experiments often end in spectacular failures, with machines exploding or malfunctioning in ways that kill their creators and anyone nearby. Mech boys are undeterred by such setbacks, viewing them as learning experiences and sources of entertainment. An explosion that kills a dozen Orks is just part of the creative process. When Orks capture an intact and functional piece of technology, especially something as sophisticated as a Space Marine Dreadnought, they approach it with a mixture of reverence and reckless enthusiasm. They know it is valuable and powerful, but they have no concept of preservation or conservation. They will immediately begin tinkering with it, adding their own modifications, testing its capabilities, and generally treating it as a new toy to play with. The fact that the machine contains a still living warrior does not concern them in the least. If anything, it makes the prize more interesting. For the Alpha Legion Dreadnought awakening in Ork custody, understanding the nature of his captors is crucial to survival. These are not enemies who can be reasoned with or manipulated in conventional ways. They do not care about honor or mercy or strategic value. They do not take hostages for ransom or prisoners for interrogation. They are driven by an alien psychology that values only strength and fighting ability. Any plan for escape or resistance must account for these fundamental truths about Ork nature. The Orks see the Dreadnought as a prize, a powerful war machine that they can either use themselves or break down for parts to build other weapons. The idea that the pilot inside might object to this treatment would strike them as irrelevant. Orks are used to their own Death Dread pilots going mad and attacking everything nearby. The fact that this particular machine contains an Imperial Space Marine rather than an Ork would be seen as a minor detail, easily solved by ripping out the original pilot and installing an Ork in his place, or perhaps just leaving the original pilot in there and seeing what happens when they force the machine to do what they want. This fundamental incompatibility between the Dreadnought's sophisticated systems and the crude Ork approach to technology creates a situation where both sides are working from completely different playbooks. The Alpha Legion Marine is thinking in terms of intelligence gathering, manipulation, long-term planning, and eventual escape. The Orks are thinking about how many guns they can mount on the Dreadnought and whether painting it red will make it go faster. The collision of these two mindsets will shape everything that follows. The capture, when precision meets chaos. The events leading to the capture likely began with violence as most stories involving orcs do. Somewhere in the galaxy, on a world whose name has been lost to history, or perhaps never recorded in the first place, an orc descended with all the subtlety of an avalanche. The greenskins came in massive numbers, their ramshackle ships filling the skies before disgorging waves of warriors eager for battle. What they found on this world varied depending on the specific circumstances, but somewhere in the chaos of conflict, they encountered an Alpha Legion installation. Perhaps it was a hidden bunker, one of the countless secret facilities the Alpha Legion maintains across the galaxy for purposes known only to themselves. Perhaps it was a temporary base established for some short-term operation that became a permanent fixture when the operatives assigned to it died or were reassigned. Perhaps it was a cache of equipment, a storage depot for war machines that might be needed at some future date. Whatever it was, it contained at least one dreadnought in stasis, and the orcs found it. The Alpha Legion would have fought, of course. Whatever forces were present would have defended their position with the skill and cunning their legion is famous for. Ambushes and traps would have thinned the orc numbers. Misdirection and false intelligence would have sent portions of the YGIGH chasing phantoms in other directions. Precision strikes would have eliminated orc leaders, hoping to disrupt the greenskin command structure. But ultimately, against a wag of sufficient size, even the Alpha Legion's tactical genius has limits. The orcs are not easily deceived when it comes to war. They have an instinctive understanding of combat that cuts through many conventional forms of misdirection. While they can be tricked in specific ways, particularly regarding intelligence about enemy strength or positions, they are much harder to fool about the fundamental nature of a conflict. An orc knows when he is in a real fight, and no amount of Alpha Legion psychological warfare can convince him otherwise. As the battle turned against the Alpha Legion defenders, they would have implemented contingency plans. Data would be purged from cogitators and memory banks. Valuable equipment would be booby-trapped or rigged for self-destruction. Sensitive materials would be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. But in the chaos of combat, with orcs pouring through defensive positions and time running out, not everything can be accounted for. Sometimes things are overlooked. Sometimes a self-destruct charge fails to detonate. Sometimes a facility that should have been completely leveled remains partially intact. And sometimes a stasis vault, designed to survive almost any assault and to protect its precious contents from the ravages of time and war, succeeds too well at its purpose. The chamber containing the Dreadnought might have survived the initial fighting, buried deep enough or shielded thoroughly enough that it escaped destruction. The orcs, in their enthusiasm for looting, would have explored every corner of the captured facility, looking for anything valuable or interesting. Eventually, they would have found the chamber. The moment of discovery must have been significant for the orcs. Here was a sealed vault, clearly important based on the level of protection surrounding it, and therefore certainly containing something worth taking. The mech boys would have been called in to examine the seals and locks. These greenskin engineers, working from instinct and brute force as much as skill, would have set about opening the vault through whatever means seemed most expedient. Precision cutting tools and passwords would be replaced by plasma torches and explosives. When the vault finally breached, the orcs would have found the Dreadnought in its stasis field. The machine would be inactive, all systems powered down to their minimal levels, but still imposing. Space. Marine dreadnoughts are larger than life, even when dormant, their bulk and obvious deadliness marking them as weapons of significance. The orcs would have recognized it immediately for what it was, and the excitement would have been palpable. A dreadnought is exactly the sort of trophy that orcs dream of capturing. It is big, it is stompy, and it is clearly built for fighting. The fact that it appears to be inactive would be seen as a solvable problem rather than a deterrent. Orc mech boys would gather around the machine, examining it with the same enthusiasm that human children might show toward a particularly interesting toy. They would prod it, test its weight, examine its weapons, and begin formulating plans for what they would do with it. The practical matter of moving the Dreadnought would require Ork ingenuity. These machines are heavy, easily weighing several tons, even without considering the additional weight of weapons and armor. The Orks would need to jury-rig some sort of lifting apparatus or transport system. This might involve a combination of crude pulleys, salvaged anti-grav plates scavenged from other equipment, and the raw muscle power of dozens of Orks working together. The process would be haphazard and dangerous, with frequent accidents and setbacks, but eventually, the Dreadnought would be loaded onto a transport and taken back to the main Ork settlement. During this entire process, the Dreadnought systems would remain in stasis, its pilot unaware of being moved. The stasis field, assuming it remained intact, would protect the pilot from the rough handling and prevent any awareness of what was happening. From the Marines' perspective, there would be no transition between being safely stored in an Alpha Legion facility and being in Ork hands. The betrayal of reality would be instantaneous and absolute when awakening finally came. The transport of the Dreadnought back to the Ork base would be an event of some significance. The Orks would be proud of their prize, showing it off to their fellows and arguing about who deserves the most credit for the capture. The war boss in charge of the WAG might come to examine it personally, assessing its potential value for his own purposes. A big mech would almost certainly stake a claim to work on it, seeing it as an opportunity to enhance his reputation and possibly create something truly spectacular. Upon arrival at the Ork settlement, the Dreadnought would be taken to a mech workshop. These workshops are chaotic places, filled with half-finished projects, piles of scrap, loud machinery, and the constant smell of burning metal and engine exhaust. Gretchen assistants scurry about carrying tools and materials, while the mech boy in charge directs the work with a combination of shouted orders and physical violence. The workshop floor might contain multiple projects in various states of completion, from def dreads being built or repaired to looted vehicles being modified, and now a space. Marine Dreadnought waiting to be examined. The mech boy would approach the Dreadnought with the same lack of reverence that Orks show toward everything. This is not disrespect exactly. Orks simply do not have the concept of treating things gently or with care. The machine would be poked and prodded. Panels would be pried open to examine internal systems. Weapons would be tested to see how they are mounted. Every action would be rough and aggressive, the Ork equivalent of careful examination, but executed with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. At some point during this examination, someone would notice that the machine is still connected to power systems, that some of its internal mechanisms are still active, even if dormant, that there appears to be something organic at its core. This discovery would be met with great interest. The mech boy would call over a pain boy to examine the biological components, and together they would begin trying to understand how the Dreadnought works. They would not have the technical manuals or understanding of Imperial technology to do this properly, but they would proceed anyway, following their instincts and making educated guesses. And inevitably, whether through deliberate action or sheer accident, someone would disrupt the stasis field. Perhaps they would disconnect the wrong cable while trying to trace power flows. Perhaps they would damage the field generator while cutting through armor to access internal systems. Perhaps they would simply not realize that some components should be left alone and would start tinkering with things they do not understand. Regardless of the specific cause, the result would be the same. The stasis field would collapse. The Dreadnought systems, freed from the suppression of stasis, would begin emergency activation sequences. Power would flow through circuits that had been dormant for 2,000 years. The reactor would spin up from its minimal standby state to full operational capacity. Life support systems would activate, pumping fluids and nutrients to the organic remains in the sarcophagus. Neural interfaces would attempt to establish connections between the biological brain and the mechanical systems. Sensory apparatus would come online, feeding data to a consciousness that was just beginning to stir. And in the depths of the sarcophagus, in the preserved remains of what was once a proud space marine of the Alpha Legion, awareness would return. It would begin as confusion, a sense of wrongness that could not yet be identified. Then would come disorientation as sensory data began flooding in, information that made no sense given the last memories the pilot possessed. And finally, understanding would dawn with all the force of a revelation. The Dreadnought was no longer where it was supposed to be. It was not in a secure facility. It was not surrounded by allies. The sounds, smells, and visual data all pointed to one impossible, horrifying conclusion. The machine had awakened in the hands of the enemy, and not just any enemy, but Orks. The thought was almost incomprehensible. How had this happened? Where were his battle brothers? How long had he been unconscious? What had transpired while he slept? The questions cascaded through a mind that was still struggling to achieve full awareness, each one adding to a growing sense of panic that the Marines' conditioning fought to suppress. The Orks, for their part, would quickly notice the change in the Dreadnought. Lights would activate on its chassis. Internal mechanisms would begin making noise. The optical sensors would start tracking movement. The machine was waking up, and the Orks would react with characteristic enthusiasm. This was exactly what they wanted, a fully functional war machine coming online right in front of them. The mech boy would be delighted. His theories about the machine proved correct. The war boss, if present, would be pleased that his warband had acquired such a valuable asset. But neither the Dreadnought nor the Orks were fully prepared for what would happen next. The Marine inside was no ordinary space marine, and the Alpha Legion had equipped their Dreadnoughts with capabilities that the Orks could not anticipate. Hidden systems were activating, protocols were engaging, and ancient programming written during the Horus Heresy era was beginning to execute. The Dreadnought might be in Ork hands physically, but the battle for control was just beginning. Wakening to nightmare. The return to consciousness is never pleasant for a Dreadnought, but this awakening transcends unpleasant and enters the realm of traumatic. The neural interfaces connecting organic brain to mechanical systems spark and surge with activity, creating the sensation of electricity coursing through every remaining nerve. The visual feeds come online first, and what they show makes no sense. Instead of the sterile interior of a stasis chamber or the reverent faces of tech priests, the optics display a chaotic jumble of crude metal walls, harsh flickering lights, and movement that resolves into green-skinned figures moving with aggressive energy. The audio systems activate next, and the cacophony is overwhelming. Where there should be the measured tones of Gothic prayers or status reports, there is instead a din of guttural voices speaking in a barbaric tongue. The linguistic analysis subroutines identify the language as Orkish and begin translating, but the results are no less disturbing. The Orks are arguing among themselves about what they plan to do with their prize, suggestions that range from mounting more guns on it to seeing if they can make it fight against one of their own deaf dreads for entertainment. The olfactory sensors come online and immediately register a complex mixture of scents that confirm the visual and auditory data. The distinctive fungal smell of Ork biology mingles with the acrid stench of poorly refined promethium, the ozone tang of plasma torches in use. Nearby, and the general miasma of an Ork workshop where maintenance and safety are unknown concepts. Environmental scanners provide temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition readings, all of which are consistent with an Ork settlement rather than any Imperial facility. For a moment, the mind within the sarcophagus rejects this reality. It must be some kind of malfunction, a glitch in the systems producing false data. Perhaps the long stasis has corrupted the sensory feeds, creating a hallucination of the worst possible scenario. The Marine's training kicks in, attempting to run diagnostics to verify the accuracy of what he is perceiving. But every system check comes back confirming the same impossible truth. This is real. This is happening. The Dreadnought has awakened in Ork captivity. The psychological impact would be immediate and devastating. For any space marine, Capture represents a profound failure, a violation of every oath and vow they have taken. They are meant to be the Emperor's finest warriors, unbreakable and indomitable. The idea of falling into enemy hands alive is considered shameful, a fate worse than death in most circumstances. And of all the possible captors, Orks might well be the worst. They are barbaric, savage, and utterly without mercy or understanding. They will not interrogate their prisoner for information or attempt to use him for propaganda purposes. They will simply treat him as an interesting piece of equipment to be experimented with. For an Alpha Legion Marine, there are additional layers of horror. The Legion's entire identity is built on being in control, on having contingencies and backup plans, on never being caught unprepared. An Alpha Legion operative is supposed to always be 3 steps ahead of his enemies, manipulating situations to his advantage, even when it appears he is at a disadvantage. But there is no being 3 steps ahead when you wake up 2,000 years displaced in time, restrained in a Dreadnought chassis, surrounded by enemies who do not even understand enough about your technology to be properly intimidated by it. The temporal displacement itself is almost impossible to process. The Dreadnought's internal chronometer, assuming it was not damaged during stasis, would show the date, and that date would be 2,000 years after the Marine's last conscious memory. 2 millennia gone in what felt like an instant. The galaxy has turned on its axis 2,000 times since he last drew breath. Empires have risen and fallen. Generations beyond counting have lived and died. And he has slept through all of it, preserved in suspension while the universe moved on without him. What happened to his brothers? What happened to his legion? Did the plans he helped set in motion succeed or fail? Are the people he knew, the Marines he served alongside, the commanders who gave him orders, are any of them still alive? The Alpha Legion's obsession with secrecy means that much of what he might have known could have been need-to-know information that he was not privy to. Even if his Legion brothers are still out there somewhere, they likely have no idea where he is or even that he still exists. For all practical purposes, he is alone, cut off from everything and everyone he knew, with no way to re-establish contact. The Dreadnought attempts to assess his situation more systematically. The tactical part of his mind, the part that has been trained to evaluate and respond to threats, begins analyzing the available data. His chassis appears to be restrained, though the exact method is not yet clear. His weapons systems are either disconnected or powered down. The control circuits do not respond when he attempts to activate them. His mobility is severely compromised. The legs of the Dreadnought seem to be locked in place, or perhaps removed entirely. He is, for all practical purposes, completely helpless. This is not a familiar state for a Space Marine Dreadnought. These war machines are designed to be dominating presences on any battlefield, towering engines of destruction that inspire fear in enemies and confidence in allies. To be reduced to a prisoner, unable to move or fight, is fundamentally at odds with the Dreadnought's purpose. The Marine's mind rebels against this reality even as he is forced to accept it. He is not a weapon at this moment. He is a trophy, a curiosity, a plaything for creatures who have no concept of the honor or significance he represents. The Orks continue their examination of the Dreadnought, oblivious to or unconcerned with the fact that their prize is now conscious and aware. A mech boy wearing a greasy red cap and festooned with tools approaches, examining the Dreadnought's optical sensors with obvious interest. He peers into the lenses, his crude face filling the Marine's field of view, and makes some comment in Orkish that the translation subroutines render as curiosity about whether the optical system could be removed and used on other equipment. The casual discussion of dismantling him provokes a response that the Marine cannot suppress. The Dreadnought's Vox system activates, and a voice that has not spoken in 2,000 years emerges. It is a mechanical rasp, filtered through speakers and processors, but it carries the unmistakable authority of an Adeptus Astartes. In High Gothic, a language the Orks almost certainly do not understand, the Marine speaks. Perhaps it is a demand for information. Perhaps it is a warning of the consequences of harming Imperial property. Perhaps it is simply a statement of identity, an assertion that despite his captivity, he remains a loyal servant of the Emperor and will not submit quietly to whatever fate the greenskins have in mind. The Orks react to the voice with surprise and delight. Their prize can talk. This makes it even more interesting. The mech boy begins examining the Vox system more closely, trying to understand how it works and whether he could replicate the K technology for his own use. Other Orks gather around, arguing loudly about what the Dreadnought said and what it might mean. Some suggest that the machine is possessed by a spirit, which would make it even more valuable. Others propose that it is simply making noise, meaningless sounds that indicate nothing more than functioning systems. A larger Ork pushes through the crowd, clearly someone of authority based on the deference shown by the others. This might be the war boss in charge of the Wei-Gi, or perhaps just a knob who has been assigned to oversee the mech boy's work. He stares at the Dreadnought with obvious interest, assessing it not as a prisoner or even really as a person, but as a potential asset. In Broken Gothic, a surprise since few Orks bother to learn human languages, he addresses the Dreadnought directly. He wants to know if the machine can fight. He wants to know if it is strong. He wants to know if it will be useful in the upcoming battles. The Marine inside the Dreadnought faces an impossible decision in this moment. Does he respond? Does he engage with these creatures in any way? Every fiber of his training screams at him to resist, to refuse any cooperation, to maintain silence and dignity in the face of the enemy. But the practical part of his mind, the part that has spent centuries learning to survive impossible situations, recognizes that complete non-cooperation might result in his immediate destruction. If the Orks conclude he is broken or useless, they might simply scrap the chassis and salvage whatever parts they think have value. Moreover, as an Alpha Legion Marine, he has been trained to think in terms of manipulation and long-term strategy. Every situation, no matter how dire, contains opportunities for those clever enough to exploit them. If he can convince the Orks that he might be useful, he might buy himself time to plan an escape, or at least to gather intelligence about his situation. The Legion's teachings emphasize adaptability, the ability to turn any circumstance to advantage. This situation is simply another problem to be solved, another obstacle to be navigated through cunning and misdirection. But there is danger in this approach as well. The Alpha Legion's tactics rely on understanding the enemy, on knowing what motivates them and what fears can be exploited. Orks are not like other enemies. Their psychology is alien in ways that are difficult for a human or even a transhuman space marine to fully grasp. They cannot be frightened into submission through threats. They cannot be bribed with promises of wealth or power. They do not care about abstract concepts like honor or duty. They care about fighting and about having fun and precious little else. If the Dreadnought attempts to manipulate the Orks and fails, if they see through his deception or simply do not care about it, then he might provoke a response that leaves him worse off than before. They might decide that a non-compliant machine is more trouble than it is worth and begin dismantling it immediately. They might become angry and express that anger through violence directed at the very systems keeping the pilot alive. The risk is substantial, but so is the potential reward if he succeeds in buying himself time and opportunity. The Marine's decision tree branches out before him, each path leading to uncertain consequences. He could attempt to convince the Orks that he is a powerful war machine that would serve their purposes if they treat him correctly. He could try to seem broken and useless, hoping they lose interest. He could attack verbally, attempting to provoke them into mistakes through anger. He could try to establish some form of communication that might lead to understanding, though the very concept seems absurd given the nature of his captors. Each approach has merits and dangers, and the wrong choice could prove fatal. While the Marine contemplates his options, the Orks continue their examination. The mech boy has moved on from the optical sensors and is now examining the weapon systems. He seems particularly interested in the assault cannon, trying to understand its mechanism and rate of fire. He disconnects several cables, apparently trying to trace the power supply, and accidentally triggers a capacitor discharge that sends a surge of energy through the dormant weapon. The resulting spark and loud crack causes the mech boy to jump back and the other orcs to laugh at his misfortune, but it also demonstrates how dangerous the orcs' ignorant tinkering could be. The pain boy arrives, summoned to examine the organic components of the Dreadnought. This particular orc is distinctive due to the crude surgical tools hanging from his belt and the various scars and modifications to his own body. He approaches the sarcophagus with the same casual indifference to safety that all orcs display, but with a specific interest in the biological aspects of the machine. He tries to find access panels that would allow him to examine the pilot directly, probing at seals and locks with implements that look more suited to demolition than medicine. Inside the sarcophagus, the Marine feels the vibrations of the pain boy's attempts to breach the inner sanctum. This is a new level of violation. The idea that these creatures might actually open the sarcophagus and see him in his degraded state. The organic remains inside are not meant for any eyes to see. They are the shameful secret of every Dreadnought pilot, the reality of what becomes of a hero's body when it is preserved beyond all natural limits. The thought of orc hands touching what little remains of his mortal form fills the Marine with a revulsion so intense it almost overwhelms his tactical thinking. He must act. He cannot remain passive while these creatures violate every protocol and desecrate what should be sacred. But what can he do? His weapons are offline, his mobility is compromised, and he is surrounded by enemies in an unknown location. The only tool he has left is his voice, the ability to communicate and potentially to deceive. It is a thin reed to grasp, but it is all he has. The Alpha Legion has always taught that the mind is the greatest weapon, that psychological warfare can achieve victories where guns and blades fail, now that teaching will be put to the ultimate test. The Dreadnought's vox activates again, but this time the voice that emerges is different. Where before it was commanding and authoritative, now it is measured and calculating. The Marine speaks in Gothic, knowing that at least some of the orcs present have demonstrated understanding of the language, or if that is too difficult, orcish words he has extracted from the orc conversation around him. He makes an offer, a bargain, information in exchange for a cessation of the pain boy's attempts to breach the sarcophagus, knowledge about how the systems work in exchange for being treated as a functional machine rather than scrap to be torn apart. The orcs listen with interest, though it is unclear whether they actually care about the bargain or are simply entertained by the idea of their prize negotiating with them. The warboss considers the offer, scratching his chin in an almost comical parody of human deep thought. Finally he speaks, his Gothic crude but understandable. He wants to know what the machine can do. He wants a demonstration of its power. If the Dreadnought is as useful as it claims, then perhaps they will not take it apart. If it is not useful, then there is no reason to keep it intact. This is the moment of truth. The Marine must decide how much cooperation he can offer without betraying his oaths or compromising his integrity as a space marine. He must find a way to satisfy the orcs' demands without actually serving their cause or helping them in their wars against the Imperium. He must walk a tightrope between usefulness and defiance, between survival and honor, and he must do all of this while still disoriented from 2,000 years of stasis, while trapped in a chassis he cannot fully control, while surrounded by enemies who could end his existence on a whim. Welcome to consciousness, Ancient One. Welcome to the nightmare that your long sleep has delivered you into. The choices you make in the next moments will determine not just your survival, but the very nature of who you are and what you represent. The Alpha Legion trained you to deceive, to manipulate, to survive against impossible odds. Now you will discover if that training was sufficient to prepare you for this, the most unexpected and horrifying of all possible awakenings. The Hydra is trapped. But even a trapped hydra has teeth. The question is whether those teeth will be enough against enemies who have never learned to fear the shadows, who fight with brutal simplicity rather than sophisticated strategy, who cannot be deceived because they barely understand the concept of truth in the first place. In the next chapter of this nightmare, we will see what happens when mechboy curiosity meets ancient technology, when orc enthusiasm for modification encounters systems designed to resist tampering, when the irresistible force of greenskin ingenuity meets the immovable object of imperial engineering. Mechboy madness. The desecration begins. The mechboy workshop where the Dreadnought has been taken is a monument to controlled chaos. Calling it organized would be generous. Calling it safe would be a complete lie. The walls are constructed from salvaged metal plates of various origins, some bearing the remnants of imperial icons, while others show crude orc glyphs painted in what might be blood or might be paint. It is hard to tell, and probably does not matter much to the orcs. The floor is littered with scrap parts, puddles of unidentifiable fluids, and the occasional Gretchen who has not moved quickly enough to avoid being stepped on. Various projects compete for space in the workshop. A deaf dread missing one arm stands against the far wall, its pilot presumably removed or dead since no sound comes from within. A pile of looted weapons occupies one corner, everything from Imperial lasguns to Eldar shuriken catapults, all waiting to be examined and incorporated into Orky designs. Several vehicles in various states of assembly or disassembly fill the central space, buggies and trucks, and one impressive-looking looted Lehman Russ tank that has been painted a garish yellow and festooned with extra guns that its original designers never intended it to carry. The big mech in charge of this workshop is called Gruzkul, though whether this is his actual name or a title or simply what the other orcs call him is unclear and probably irrelevant to him. He is a massive specimen, even by orc standards, his green skin covered in scars and crude bionics that replace parts he has lost in various industrial accidents or fights. His left eye is a mechanical apparatus that glows with a sickly red light, supposedly giving him the ability to see heat signatures, though it might just be for show. His right arm has been replaced below the elbow with a crude power claw that also serves as a tool for his work. He wears a grease-stained leather apron festooned with pockets containing various implements, and the ubiquitous red hat that marks him as a mech boy. Gruzkul looks at the Dreadnought with an expression that combines greed, curiosity, and childlike excitement. This is the sort of prize that a mech dreams of finding, a sophisticated piece of imperial technology in relatively intact condition. The fact that it appears to be functional, with lights activated and systems running, makes it even better. The fact that it can talk, well, that is just fascinating. Gruzkul is already formulating plans for what he might do with this prize, ideas racing through his mind with the kind of creative chaos that typifies orc thinking. The first order of business, as Gruzkul sees it, is to understand how the machine works. Not in the sense of reading technical manuals or following proper procedures. Those concepts are alien to the orc way of doing things, but in the sense of poking at things until they do something interesting. He begins by examining the Dreadnought's exterior, running his hands over the armor plates, testing the weight and thickness of the ceramite. He taps on various surfaces, listening to the sound to determine what might be underneath. He finds seams and joints, access panels, and maintenance hatches, and begins working on opening them. The Dreadnought systems were designed to resist tampering, but they were designed with Imperial tech priests in mind, enemies who would approach such work with deliberation and proper tools. They were not designed to resist an orc mech boy who has no concept of proper procedure and is willing to apply brute force, supplemented by surprising technical intuition. Gruzkul wedges his power claw into a seam and leverages it open, the tortured squeal of metal being bent beyond its design, tolerances echoing through the workshop. Access is gained not through authentication protocols, but through the simple application of overwhelming mechanical advantage. Inside the now exposed compartment, Grozkul finds cable bundles, servos, and various components, whose functions he can only guess at. He begins pulling on cables to see what they are connected to, an approach that would give any Imperial tech priest a heart attack, but which the Ork finds perfectly reasonable. Some cables resist his pulling, others come free easily, and a few spark when disconnected, creating flashes of light that make him jump back and then laugh at his own reaction. The Dreadnought's internal diagnostic systems go wild with error messages as critical connections are severed, subsystems failing or entering safe mode as their control circuits are violated. The Marine inside can feel each violation as if it were being done to his own body. The neural interfaces that connect him to the machine create a form of proprioception, a sense of the chassis as an extension of his physical form. When Grozkul wrenches open an access panel, the Marine feels it as a tearing sensation. When cables are disconnected, it is like losing sensation in a limb. When systems fail, the accompanying surge of error messages creates something very much like pain, not true physical pain, since the organic tissue that could experience such sensations is minimal, but a mental distress that serves the same function. He tries to protest, to warn the mech boy that what he is doing is dangerous not just for the Dreadnought, but for the Ork himself. Some of the systems being tampered with carry dangerous voltages or contain volatile fluids. The reactor, while stable, could become unstable if its containment is compromised. The weapon systems, though currently inactive, could potentially be triggered by the wrong combination of inputs. But his warnings, delivered through the Vox system in a mixture of Gothic and broken Orkish, are largely ignored. The Orks seem to view the danger as part of the fun, the possibility of an explosion adding excitement to the proceedings rather than serving as a deterrent. Grozkul moves on to examining the weapon systems. The assault cannon mounted on the Dreadnought's right arm is of particular interest to him. He has seen similar weapons on other Imperial machines and has always been impressed by their rate of fire. He tries to rotate the weapon assembly to see how it is mounted, applying force until the mounting bracket begins to give way with another screech of protesting metal. The servos that should control the weapon's movement are fighting against his strength, creating a grinding sound that makes it clear this is not how the system is meant to be operated. The mech boy's examination becomes more aggressive as his curiosity intensifies. He wants to see inside the weapon itself, to understand the mechanism that allows it to fire so quickly. He finds a maintenance panel on the assault cannon and, lacking the proper tools or knowledge to open it correctly, simply tears it off. Inside are the feed mechanism, the rotating barrels, and the complex system of springs and electromagnetic accelerators that give the weapon its devastating performance. Grozkul pokes at these components with his thick fingers, his touch anything but delicate, causing several parts to shift out of alignment or break entirely under the pressure. The Dreadnought's tactical systems calculate that the assault cannon is now approximately 30% less effective than it was before the mech boy's examination, and that estimate might be optimistic. Components that were precisely calibrated are now misaligned. Parts that were meant to remain lubricated are now exposed to air and contamination. The weapon might still fire, assuming its power supply and ammunition feed are intact, but it will not fire with anything approaching its original accuracy or reliability. This process of degradation is only just beginning. A team of Gretchen arrive, summoned by Grozkul to assist with the larger work. These small greenskins are nervous around the Dreadnought, correctly perceiving it as something dangerous even in its current restrained state. They approach with obvious reluctance, only moving forward when the mech boy shouts at them or threatens them with violence. Each Gretchen is given a specific task, usually something involving climbing into tight spaces or holding heavy components, work that the larger Orks cannot or will not do themselves. One particularly brave or foolish Gretchen is ordered to climb up the Dreadnought's chassis and examine the top-mounted systems. The small creature scampers up the armor plates, its clawed feet finding purchase on seams and decorative elements. When it reaches the top, It begins pulling on cables and prodding at components it finds there, following shouted instructions from Gruzkul below. At one point, it accidentally activates a sensor array, causing the Dreadnought's optical systems to suddenly gain additional visual data from an unexpected angle. The Marine inside uses this brief moment of expanded awareness to take in more of his surroundings, cataloging details about the workshop and the Orks present, before the sensor feed is cut off again, when the Gretchen disconnects whatever cable it had touched. The Pain Boy returns, still interested in examining the organic components of the Dreadnought. He has brought tools with him this time, cruel-looking implements that are part surgical equipment and part torture devices. He focuses his attention on the sarcophagus itself, the armored chamber at the Dreadnought's core that contains what little remains of the pilot's physical body. This component is the most heavily protected part of the entire machine, for obvious reasons. It is designed to withstand tremendous damage and to resist any attempt to access it without proper authorization. But the Pain Boy is nothing if not persistent. He begins working on the sarcophagus with the same brutal efficiency that Gruzkul applied to the rest of the Dreadnought. He tries to find seams he can exploit, looking for weak points in the armor. When he cannot find any obvious vulnerabilities, he brings out a plasma torch and begins cutting. The beam of superheated matter bites into the ceramite, creating a glowing line that traces across the surface of the sarcophagus. The temperature inside the chamber begins to rise as the exterior armor heats up, and the Marine can feel his environment becoming uncomfortably warm. The Dreadnought's systems include defenses against this sort of attack, countermeasures designed to protect the pilot from harm. Emergency cooling systems activate, pumping heat away from the sarcophagus and venting it through exhaust ports. Ablative layers in the armor structure are designed to dissipate the energy of cutting tools. But these systems were designed for battlefield conditions, for short-term exposure to hostile fire, not for sustained cutting by someone who has all the time in the world and no concern for the consequences of failure. The Marine uses his Vox system to speak again, this time directly addressing the Pain Boy. He tries to explain that damaging the sarcophagus will kill him, and that killing him will make the Dreadnought useless. The machine needs a pilot to function properly. Without the consciousness at its core to direct it, the Dreadnought is just an expensive and complicated piece of scrap. This argument, he hopes, might appeal to the Orks' desire to keep their prize functional. The Pain Boy pauses in his cutting to consider this argument. He does not seem overly concerned about the possibility of killing the pilot, but he does seem interested in the question of whether the machine will still work without one. He shouts a question to Gruzkul, asking if they could just stick an Ork in there instead if the current pilot dies. The mech boy considers this possibility, scratching his chin thoughtfully. On one hand, having an Ork pilot would make the machine properly Orky. On the other hand, they do not really know how to implant a pilot into a Dreadnought, and the current setup seems to be working well enough. After some discussion, the two Orks reach a decision. They will not try to kill the pilot, at least not deliberately, but they are going to continue examining the machine, and if the pilot happens to die during that examination, well, that is just bad luck for him. The Pain Boy moves away from the sarcophagus, having been warned off from that particular course of action. But his interest in the Dreadnought's biological systems remains. He begins examining the life support apparatus, trying to understand what each tube and cable does, occasionally disconnecting things to see what happens. Each disconnection sends a new wave of distress through the Marine's awareness. One cable controls nutrient flow, and when it is severed, he experiences something like hunger for the first time in centuries. Another manages waste elimination, and its loss creates a sense of contamination as the sealed system's balance is disrupted. A third regulates temperature, and its removal causes uncomfortable fluctuations that the Marine's degraded body can barely sense, but which register as wrongness in his consciousness. The Pain Boy is not trying to kill him, at least not deliberately, but the cumulative effect of all these small damages is pushing the life support systems toward failure. Meanwhile, Gruzkul has moved on to examining the Dreadnought's locomotion systems. He is disappointed to discover that the legs have been removed at some point, presumably during transport, to make the machine easier to move. He makes a note to have some of the Gretchen go find the legs and bring them to the workshop. In the meantime, he is interested in how the hip joints and balance systems work. He disconnects the remaining leg mounts from the torso, which causes the Dreadnought's entire upper body to settle lower to the ground with a heavy thump. The sudden shift in orientation triggers the balance management system, which attempts to compensate for the change and fails spectacularly, generating error messages that flood the Marine's consciousness. The examination continues for hours, a methodical desecration carried out with enthusiasm and complete disregard for proper procedure. Every system is probed, every component tested to destruction, every protocol violated. The Orks work with the kind of joyful curiosity that children might show while taking apart a complex toy. Except these children are massive greenskins, with crude tools and no concept of being careful. They are learning, in their own way, understanding the Dreadnought through a process of aggressive exploration that would make any Imperial tech priest weep. And through it all, the Marine inside is forced to endure. He cannot fight back. His weapons remain offline, and his mobility is gone. He cannot escape. He has no idea where he is, or how he might get away, even if he were free. He cannot call for help. He is cut off from any allies who might exist, and is not even sure if his legion still functions in any organized form after 2,000 years. All he can do is bear witness to the violation of his machine body, experiencing each assault as a fresh trauma, and try to maintain some core of identity and purpose, despite everything being done to him. The psychological toll is immense. The Marine has endured much in his long existence, has fought through countless battles, has witnessed horrors that would drive normal humans mad. But this is different. This is not combat, where his training and instincts can take over. This is helplessness, pure and absolute, the complete inability to affect his own fate. It is a form of torture, not through deliberate cruelty, but through indifferent curiosity, which somehow makes it worse. The Orks are not trying to break him. They simply do not care about his suffering one way or another. As night falls over the Ork settlement, the work in the workshop slows, but does not stop entirely. Gruzkul has lit a series of crude oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across the space. Some of the Gretchen have fallen asleep in corners, exhausted from their labors. But the mech boy continues his examination, too fascinated by his prize to rest. He has opened a panel that reveals part of the neural interface system, the delicate connections between organic brain and machine consciousness, and he is studying them with an intensity that might be called scholarly if applied to anyone other than an Ork. The Marine watches through his optical sensors, helpless to prevent this continued violation. He has tried reasoning with the Orks, has tried warning them, has tried everything his tactical mind can conceive to make them stop, or at least slow down. Nothing has worked. The Orks are driven by curiosity and enthusiasm, forces that cannot be reasoned with or manipulated in conventional ways. They are immune to his psychological warfare because they barely understand that it is happening. And yet, in the depths of this nightmare, the Marine finds himself analyzing, planning, thinking, because that is what the Alpha Legion trained him to do. Every situation contains opportunities, no matter how desperate it appears. The Orks are learning about his systems, but he is also learning about them. He is observing their reactions, understanding their decision-making processes, mapping the social dynamics of the warband. This information might be useless. He might not survive long enough to act on any of it. But the gathering of intelligence is instinctive, something he does without conscious thought, because it is so deeply ingrained in his nature. He notes that Gruzkul is clearly in charge of the workshop, but defers to someone else, probably the war boss, for major decisions. He notes that the Gretchen are afraid of the Orks, but are also somewhat cunning, occasionally taking small items when they think no one is watching. He notes the layout of the workshop, the locations of exits, the presence of other weapons and equipment that might be useful. He notes everything, filing it all away in memory banks that he hopes will remain intact despite the damage being done to his systems. Because there will come a moment, he tells himself. There will come a time when opportunity presents itself, and when that moment arrives, he must be ready to act. The Alpha Legion has never taught surrender. They have taught adaptation, deception, survival through cunning. Even in this worst of all possible scenarios, those lessons remain relevant. He is trapped, damaged, violated, but he is not dead. And so long as consciousness persists, so long as the spark of awareness remains, there is possibility. The night stretches on, and the desecration continues. The Dreadnought endures and plans. Alpha Legion Protocols, fighting from within. Deep within the most protected memory cores of the Dreadnought, sealed behind encryption that has survived 2,000 years, something begins to stir. These are not the standard systems that govern the machine's operation. These are the secret protocols, the hidden programs, the classified directives that were installed when this Dreadnought was first created during the Horus Heresy era. They are the Alpha Legion's insurance policy, their contingency for situations that were considered unlikely but not impossible. And one of those situations, capture by hostile forces, has now occurred. The protocols begin their activation sequence, triggered by a combination of factors. The prolonged absence of proper authentication from Legion tech priests. The detection of unauthorized access attempts. The clear evidence of hostile action being taken against the Dreadnought's systems. These data points, evaluated by autonomous systems that operate below the level of the pilot's conscious awareness, have reached the threshold necessary to initiate the contingency programming. The Dreadnought may be in Ork hands physically, but the battle for information security is about to begin in earnest. The first protocol to activate is a data purging routine. Any classified information that might be useful to an enemy is flagged for deletion. Mission logs, tactical assessments, Legion organizational data, everything that could provide intelligence value begins to be overwritten with random noise. The process is gradual and selective, designed to eliminate sensitive material while preserving the information necessary for the Dreadnought to function. But it means that much of what the Marine remembers about his service, before being placed in stasis, will be lost. The memories erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. The Marine feels this process as a form of amnesia creeping in, around the edges of his awareness. Details that he should remember become hazy and indistinct. Names of battle brothers fade from recall. Specific operations blur together into generic categories. It is disturbing to lose memories, but he understands the necessity. Better that the information be lost than fall into enemy hands. The Alpha Legion has always valued operational security above all else, even above the comfort and well-being of individual operatives. That a Dreadnought pilot should lose his own memories to prevent data compromise is considered an acceptable cost. But not all of the protocols are defensive. Some are aggressive, designed to create problems for anyone attempting to examine or use the Dreadnought. A subroutine activates that begins introducing subtle errors into any data readouts that the Orks might examine. Diagnostic screens will show incorrect information, leading any tech-minded Ork to make wrong conclusions about how the systems work. Power flow indicators will display values that are off by 10% in random directions, making it harder to understand the machine's energy distribution. Sensor calibrations will gradually drift, ensuring that any information gained from the Dreadnought's advanced detection gear will be unreliable. Another protocol deals with the machine's reactor. The Dreadnought's power source is a compact but sophisticated piece of technology, a miniaturized version of the same plasma reactors that power Imperial starships. In normal operation, it is stable and reliable, capable of running for centuries with minimal maintenance. But the protocol introduces deliberate inefficiencies into the reactor's operation, causing it to run hotter than it should, and to require more frequent maintenance than normal. This serves two purposes. First, it makes the Dreadnought more difficult for the Orks to use effectively, as overheating will limit operational time. Second, it creates the possibility that the reactor might fail catastrophically if pushed too hard, taking anyone nearby with it when it goes. The Marine becomes aware of these protocols as they activate, receiving notification through internal status messages that most of his hidden systems are now operational. He did not consciously trigger them, they activated on their own based on the situation assessment. But he approves of their function. If he cannot prevent the Orks from examining his chassis, he can at least make that examination more dangerous and less rewarding than they anticipated. Every false lead they follow, every incorrect conclusion they draw, every component that fails unexpectedly will slow their progress and increase the chances of a critical mistake. But the most important protocol, the one that gives the Marine a genuine sliver of hope, is the communication subroutine. The Alpha Legion, paranoid and thorough as always, equipped their dreadnoughts with hidden communication systems that could operate independently of the main Vox. Arrays. These systems use different frequencies and encryption schemes than standard Imperial communications, making them harder to detect or intercept. They are designed to send coded bursts of data at irregular intervals, attempting to contact any friendly forces that might be in range. The protocol has already begun transmitting, sending out signals that identify the Dreadnought and report its situation. The messages are brief and heavily compressed, lasting only microseconds each time they transmit, making them difficult to detect even for sophisticated monitoring equipment, let alone for Ork sensors. The content is simple: a distress code specific to the Alpha Legion, coordinates if the machine's position can be determined, and a request for extraction or assistance. The messages go out into the void, traveling at the speed of light through the darkness between stars, seeking any receiver that might be listening. The odds of success are astronomical. The Marine has no idea where he is in the galaxy, no knowledge of what Alpha Legion forces might be operating in this region, no guarantee that his Legion even maintains listening posts or response teams anymore after 2,000 years. The signals might be traveling through empty space with no one to hear them. They might be detected by enemies rather than allies. They might reach friendly ears, but be deemed too risky to respond to. 1,000 things could go wrong, and only one very specific set of circumstances would result in a rescue. But the mere possibility is enough to sustain hope. Somewhere out there, the signals are traveling. Somewhere out there, they might reach someone who cares. Somewhere out there, the Alpha Legion might still remember one of its own, even one who has been lost for 2 millennia. It is a thread, thin as a spider's silk, but it is something to hold on to when everything else has been taken away. In the workshop, Gruzkul has moved on to examining the Dreadnought's reactor, drawn by the heat and energy signatures emanating from the chassis. He does not know about the protocols that have just made his examination significantly more dangerous. He approaches the reactor access panel with the same enthusiasm he has shown for everything else, eager to understand how this particular piece of Imperial technology functions. He opens the panel, releasing a wave of heat that would be uncomfortable even for an Ork's hardy constitution, and peers inside at the glowing plasma containment field. The reactor systems, operating under the influence of the sabotage protocol, are running at higher temperatures and pressures than their design specifications allow. The containment field is holding, but it is stressed in ways that are not immediately obvious to visual inspection. Gruzkul, not knowing what normal operation should look like, assumes that everything he sees is correct. He begins poking at components, trying to understand their function, each touch bringing him closer to triggering a cascade failure that could turn the entire Dreadnought into a miniature sun. The Marine, aware of the danger, faces another terrible choice. Should he warn the Orks? If the reactor fails while the Painboy and Gruzkul are working on the Dreadnought, both will certainly die, along with anyone else nearby. The explosion might be large enough to damage other equipment in the workshop or even destroy the entire building. From a tactical perspective, this would be a victory of sorts, the elimination of valuable enemy assets through their own ignorance. but it would also mean his own death, the final end of a consciousness that has persisted across 2,000 years. Is he willing to die to take these orcs with him? The question hangs in his mind, unanswered. Part of him, the part that has been trained as a space marine and taught that duty comes before all else, says yes. Better to die with honor, taking enemies with you, than to survive in captivity and shame. But another part, the part that has been shaped by the Alpha Legion's philosophy of survival and adaptability, argues for patience. Death is final, but survival creates possibilities. So long as he lives, so long as consciousness persists, there is a chance, however slim, that his situation might change. Before he can fully resolve this internal conflict, the decision is taken out of his hands. The transmission protocol sends out another coded burst, and this time, impossibly, there is a response. It is faint, barely distinguishable from background radiation, and the encryption is complex enough that it takes the Dreadnought system several seconds to decode it. But the message, when it finally resolves into comprehensible text, is clear and unmistakable. Message acknowledged. Maintain operational status. Extraction under evaluation. Hydra Dominatus. Someone heard. Someone answered. The Alpha Legion, in some form, still exists and is aware of his predicament. They cannot promise rescue. The message is careful not to commit to anything specific, but they are evaluating the situation. This means that somewhere, analysts are looking at his location, assessing the risk-reward calculation of a rescue attempt, determining whether one ancient dreadnought is worth the resources and danger that extraction would require. He might still die here, might still be abandoned to his fate, but at least he is not forgotten. At least the Legion remembers. This knowledge changes everything. It does not improve his immediate situation. He is still trapped and damaged and at the mercy of Orks, who have no concept of mercy. But it gives him a reason to endure, a purpose beyond mere survival. If extraction is possible, if there is a chance of returning to his Legion, then he must do whatever is necessary to stay alive and functional until that chance can be acted upon. He must manage the Orks carefully, keeping them interested enough to maintain him, but not so interested that they destroy him through their examinations. He must preserve his systems as best he can, protecting what can be protected and accepting damage where it cannot be avoided. The Marine begins to engage more actively with his captors, not to genuinely help them, but to guide their examinations toward less critical systems. When Gruzkul approaches a particularly dangerous component, the Dreadnought's Vox activates to suggest that a different system might be more interesting to examine. The suggestions are phrased carefully, appealing to Ork curiosity without appearing to be desperate attempts at manipulation. The goal is to make the mechs feel like they are learning and discovering on their own, while actually being steered away from the most critical vulnerabilities. This approach works, to a degree. Orks are not suspicious by nature. They tend to take things at face value unless given obvious reason to think otherwise. When the Dreadnought suggests that the sensor array might be interesting, Gruzkul accepts this suggestion and shifts his attention to that system. The Marine breathes a mental sigh of relief as the mech boy moves away from the reactor, at least temporarily. He has bought himself some time, though at the cost of allowing another system to be violated and damaged. The examination of the sensor array is thorough and destructive. Gruzkul pulls out components to see how they connect, breaks seals to examine internal mechanisms, and generally treats the sophisticated equipment as if it were a simple machine rather than a precision instrument. The Marine feels each act of desecration as another small death, another piece of his capability being stripped away. But he endures, because endurance is all he has, and because somewhere out there, someone is watching and evaluating and possibly preparing to do something about his situation. Days pass in this manner, a cycle of examination and damage and desperate management of Ork curiosity. The Dreadnought systems continue to degrade under the constant abuse, functionality dropping, as more and more components are broken or disconnected. The weapons systems are now barely operational. The mobility servos that remain are damaged and misaligned. The sensors are giving readings that are questionable at best. The Marine feels himself becoming less and less of a war machine and more of a statue, a monument to what he once was, rather than a functional tool of war. But he is still alive. The reactor still runs, though overheating remains a constant concern. The life support still functions, though several redundant systems have been damaged beyond repair. The consciousness at the Dreadnought's core still persists, still thinks and plans and hopes. And the hidden communication system still sends its coded bursts into the void, still receives occasional acknowledgements that confirm someone, somewhere, is listening. The psychological strain of this existence is immense. Every day brings new violations, new damages, new indignities. The Marine has gone from being a proud warrior of the Adeptus Astartes to being a prisoner subjected to ongoing torture, though his torturers do not even realize that is what they are doing. The Orks see him as a fascinating puzzle to be taken apart and understood. They do not comprehend the suffering they cause, and would not care if they did. To them, he is equipment, not a person, and equipment exists to be used and examined and modified as needed. The Alpha Legion training helps the Marine maintain his sanity through this ordeal. He has been taught to compartmentalize, to separate his emotions from his tactical thinking, to focus on objectives rather than on feelings. He treats each day as a mission, with the goal of surviving to the next day, while preserving as much functionality as possible. He monitors the Orks, learning their patterns and personalities, identifying who makes decisions and who can be influenced. He builds a mental model of the warband's structure, filing away information that might be useful if escape or rescue becomes possible. And he waits, because waiting is what he has done for 2,000 years, and waiting is what he will continue to do until either rescue arrives or death finally claims him. In the darkness of the sarcophagus, in the shell of the broken machine, in the workshop of the Ork mech boys, an ancient consciousness endures and plots and refuses to surrender. The Hydra has been wounded, but it is not dead. And a wounded Hydra is perhaps the most dangerous kind. The Orkification process. As days turn into weeks, the Dreadnought's transformation accelerates. Gruzkul has decided that simply examining the machine is not enough. He wants to make it properly Orky, to improve it according to his own vision of what a good war machine should be. This decision marks the beginning of a new phase in the Marine's captivity, one where the violations become not just investigative, but transformative. The Orks are no longer content to understand the Dreadnought as it is. They want to remake it in their own image. The first major modification is purely aesthetic, but symbolically devastating. Gruzkul decides that the Dreadnought needs proper Ork colors. The careful blue-green that marked it as an Alpha Legion machine, that color-shifting quality that spoke of secrets and deception, is unacceptable to the mechboy's sensibilities. He orders his Gretchen assistants to bring paint, lots of paint, in the colors that Orks favor. Red for speed, yellow for explosiveness, black and white checks for contrast, and generous amounts of green because everything Orky should have green on it. The painting process is carried out with the same lack of care that characterizes all Ork work. The Gretchens slap paint onto the Dreadnought's armor in thick, uneven coats, covering the centuries-old heraldry with crude brushstrokes. The Legion's insignia disappears beneath layers of garish color. The honored markings that indicated the Dreadnought's victories and service are obliterated. The machine that was once a sophisticated war engine of the Alpha Legion becomes something that looks like it belongs in an Ork warband, festooned with clashing colors and crude patterns that would make any Imperial observer recoil in horror. The Marine experiences this desecration with a combination of rage and despair. His armor, his colors, the visual representation of everything he has served and fought for is being destroyed before his optical senses. He wants to scream, to fight, to do something to prevent this violation of his identity, but he is helpless, can only watch as the paint covers everything, transforming him from a proud warrior of the Alpha Legion into what appears to be some kind of Orky experiment. The psychological impact is profound, as if the external transformation is somehow making him less himself, less human, less real. But worse than the paint is what comes next. Gruzkul has decided that the Dreadnought needs better weapons. Not better in the sense of more effective or more accurate, but better in the sense of more Orky. The assault cannon is deemed insufficient because it does not make enough noise or have enough barrels. The power fist is functional but boring, lacking the proper amount of whirring blades and grinding teeth that a good Ork weapon should have. These sophisticated pieces of Imperial technology need to be replaced with proper Orky weapons that reflect the true nature of war. The removal of the original weapons is brutal. Gruzkul does not bother with proper dismounting procedures or careful preservation of mounting points. He simply cuts through the connections with a plasma torch, severing the weapons from the chassis and letting them fall to the workshop floor with heavy crashes. Each weapon is a masterwork of Imperial engineering, irreplaceable given that the knowledge to create them has been lost. Each weapon is casually destroyed, not out of malice, but out of simple Ork indifference to anything that is not immediately useful to their purposes. The Marine feels each amputation as a loss, not of sensation exactly, since the weapons were never truly part of his flesh, but of capability and identity. These weapons have been with him since his interment, have been the tools through which he has prosecuted war for centuries before his long sleep. They are not just equipment, they are extensions of his will, instruments through which he has defended the Imperium and served the Emperor. And now they are scrap on a workshop floor, waiting to be melted down or incorporated into some other Ork project. The replacement weapons are monstrosities by Imperial standards. On the right arm, where the assault cannon once sat, Gruzkul mounts a device he calls a big shooter. It is a massive gun cobbled together from multiple smaller weapons, featuring an excessive number of barrels pointing in slightly different directions. The ammunition feed is a crude belt system that looks like it might jam at any moment. The whole assembly is held together with liberal amounts of welding and what appears to be wire and hope. It should not work. By all reasonable engineering principles, it should fall apart the moment someone tries to fire it. But the WAAG field makes it functional enough. On the left arm, the power fist is replaced with an Ork power claw. This crude device features oversized pincers with grinding teeth, powered by a motor that emits a constant noise somewhere between a roar and a scream. It lacks the finesse of the Imperial power fist, trades precision for brute crushing force, but it is undeniably effective at tearing things apart. The motor that drives it is poorly balanced, creating vibrations that transfer through the entire arm assembly, but Gruzkul seems to consider this a feature rather than a bug, claiming that the shaking makes it more killy. The mounting of these weapons requires modifications to the Dreadnought's arm structure. The attachment points are different from Imperial specifications. The power requirements are not quite compatible, and the control systems are utterly incompatible. Gruzkul solves these problems with characteristic Ork directness. He welds mounting brackets wherever they seem to fit, splices power cables together with minimal regard for voltage compatibility, and rigs up crude control linkages that might respond to the pilot's input or might not. It is hard to say. The result is a system that technically works, but bears no resemblance to the elegant integration of the original design. The Marine attempts to test the new weapons, trying to move the arms and activate the firing mechanisms. The responses are delayed and imprecise. The big shooter powers up with a whine that suggests its capacitors are not properly regulated. The power claw activates, but with a grinding sound that indicates the gears are not properly lubricated. Both weapons feel wrong. The neural feedback is garbled and unclear, as if there is a layer of static between his intention and the weapon's response. He can use them, in theory, but not with anything approaching the skill and precision he once commanded. Gruzkul is not finished with his improvements. He decides that the Dreadnought needs additional armor, not because the existing protection is insufficient, but because more armor is always better in Ork thinking. He begins welding metal plates onto the chassis, thick slabs of salvaged steel that add weight and bulk without providing any real improvement in protection. The placement is random, guided more by what fits than by any tactical consideration of where armor might actually be needed. The result is a machine that looks heavier and more aggressive, but is actually less mobile and more poorly balanced than before. The additional weight is a problem for the already damaged mobility systems. The servos that control movement are stressed beyond their design limits, motors straining to move a chassis that now weighs significantly more than it should. The Marine can feel the reluctance in the systems, the way they struggle to respond to his commands, the grinding protest of mechanisms being pushed too hard. He knows that if he is ever able to actually use this machine in combat, the mobility will be severely compromised, turning what was once an agile combat walker into something that can barely move at walking speed. But perhaps the most disturbing modification is what Gruzkul does to the Dreadnought's exterior decoration. He decides that the machine needs proper Ork glyphs and symbols to mark it as part of his warband. He personally paints a massive Ork face on the front of the chassis, a crude representation with tusks and evil-looking eyes that leers out at anyone who approaches. He adds various Ork symbols around this central image, skulls and crossed bones and jagged lightning bolts, all rendered in the rough style that characterizes Ork art. The Marine is forced to see this every time his optical sensors focus on a reflective surface. His chassis, once a proud symbol of the Alpha Legion, now bears the marks of the enemy. He looks like an Ork machine, a looted dreadnought that has been pressed into service by greenskin warriors. The transformation is almost complete from a visual perspective. An outside observer who saw him now would not immediately recognize him as Imperial. They might well mistake him for some kind of sophisticated Ork walker, a death dread with unusual features but fundamentally Orky in nature. This visual transformation has psychological implications that the Marine struggles with. He knows intellectually that paint and decorations do not change who he is, that beneath the Ork modifications, he remains a space Marine of the Alpha Legion, loyal to the Emperor and dedicated to the destruction of his enemies. But seeing himself in this violated form, looking at his reflection and seeing an Ork war machine rather than an Imperial dreadnought, creates a cognitive dissonance that is difficult to resolve. He does not recognize himself anymore. The machine he inhabits has become something alien and wrong. The modifications continue over weeks. Gruzkul adds a crude loudspeaker system that blares aggressive Ork music or battle cries when activated. He installs additional fuel tanks for the power claw, bulbous containers strapped to the chassis with chains and cables. He mounts a banner pole on the back of the dreadnought, currently empty, but ready to display whatever flag the warboss might decree. Each addition makes the machine more Orky and less Imperial, further corrupting what was once a sacred artifact of the Adeptus Astartes. Through all of this, the Marine endures and adapts. He learns how to work with the crude Ork systems, figuring out their quirks and limitations through trial and error. The big shooter tends to veer left when firing, so he compensates by aiming slightly right. The power claw has a delay in its activation sequence, so he learns to trigger it earlier than he would an Imperial weapon. The additional armor creates blind spots in his visual coverage, so he develops new ways of tracking his surroundings using audio sensors and environmental awareness. In a perverse way, this process of adaptation is not entirely unlike the Alpha Legion's core philosophy. The Legion has always emphasized adaptability, the ability to function with whatever tools and resources are available, the capacity to turn any situation to advantage. If the Dreadnought must work with Ork weapons and systems, then that is simply another challenge to be overcome through skill and intelligence. The Marine does not accept his situation, never stops planning for escape or rescue. but he also does not allow despair to paralyze him. He adapts because adaptation is survival, and survival is the first step toward eventual victory. The psychological warfare component of his captivity also begins to shift during this period. Having observed the Orks for weeks now, the Marine starts to understand their social dynamics and decision-making processes in ways that might be exploitable. He notes that Gruzkul is proud of his modifications and seeks validation from other Orks about how clever and skilled his work is. He notes that the war boss is interested in having powerful weapons and warriors to throw at his enemies. He notes that even Orks have a kind of status hierarchy that can be manipulated if one understands the rules. The Marine begins to subtly encourage Gruzkul's pride in the Dreadnought, making occasional comments through the Vox system about how impressive the modifications are or how much more killy the machine has become. This is not genuine praise, obviously, but manipulation designed to keep the mech boy invested in maintaining and preserving the Dreadnought rather than scrapping it for parts. The more Gruzkul views the machine as his personal achievement, the more likely he is to continue working on it and protecting it from other Orks who might want to steal or destroy it. Similarly, the Marine begins to position himself as a potential asset to the war boss. When opportunities arise to interact with the larger greenskin leader, he speaks of the Dreadnought's capabilities in combat, suggesting that he could be useful in upcoming battles if properly maintained and deployed. He does not offer to actually fight for the Orks, that would be a betrayal too far, but he plants the seed of the idea that keeping the Dreadnought functional might have strategic value. It is a delicate game, offering just enough cooperation to seem useful while never crossing the line into actual betrayal of his oaths. The communications with his distant legion continue sporadically, coded bursts sent and received at irregular intervals. The messages are never long or detailed, always brief acknowledgements and status updates. But they confirm that someone is still monitoring his situation, still evaluating possibilities, still considering whether and how extraction might be achieved. This knowledge sustains the Marine through the worst moments of his captivity, the times when the violations and degradation threaten to overwhelm his ability to endure. As the Orkification process nears completion, as the Dreadnought becomes more and more integrated into the Ork warband's equipment, a new phase of his captivity begins. Gruzkul announces that the machine is ready for field testing. The warboss has approved using the Dreadnought in an upcoming raid against some Imperial settlement, a chance to see how well the modifications work in actual combat. The Marine realizes, with a sinking feeling, that he is about to face perhaps the most difficult test yet. Will he fight when commanded? Will he actually take arms against Imperial forces to preserve his own existence? Or will he refuse and accept whatever consequences the Orks choose to inflict? The question has been theoretical until now, something that might happen in the future. But that future has arrived, and with it comes a choice that will define who he is and what he has become. The next chapter of this nightmare is about to unfold, and it will test not just his tactical skills or his will to survive, but his very identity as a space marine and a servant of the Emperor. Conclusion: the ultimate price of service. We have journeyed through a nightmare that exists on the bleeding edge of what is possible in the grim darkness of the far future. We have witnessed the slow awakening of an ancient warrior, the violation of sacred technology, the clash between sophisticated strategy and brutal simplicity. We have seen what happens when an Alpha Legion Dreadnought, asleep for 2,000 years, falls into Ork hands and must navigate a situation that no amount of training could have prepared him for. This story, while hypothetical, illuminates several profound truths about the Warhammer 40,000 universe and the nature of those who serve within it. It shows us the terrible price of immortality, the curse that is wrapped in the blessing of continued service. The Dreadnought pilot, preserved beyond all natural limits, experiences a form of existence that transcends life and death to become something darker and stranger than either. He is a ghost in a machine, a consciousness trapped between worlds, serving a purpose that grows more abstract with each passing century. The Alpha Legion dimension adds layers of complexity to this tragedy. This is a warrior trained to deceive, to manipulate, to control situations through superior intelligence and planning. Yet he finds himself in a scenario where those skills are nearly useless, where the enemy's very simplicity makes them immune to sophisticated psychological warfare. The irony is bitter and complete. The masters of deception are defeated not by superior deception, but by enemies too crude to understand that they are being manipulated. And the Orks, in their own way, represent a kind of terrible honesty. They are what they appear to be: brutal, aggressive, enthusiastic about violence and creation in equal measure. They do not torture the Dreadnought out of malice or strategic calculation. They simply examine their prize with the same enthusiasm they would show for any interesting piece of technology. Their violations are not personal. They are not even aware that they are violations. This makes them somehow worse, for there is no negotiating with indifference, no appealing to mercy that does not exist. The possible outcomes of this situation vary in their horror and their hope. Perhaps rescue comes, Alpha Legion operatives executing a precision extraction that showcases their legendary skill at impossible operations. Perhaps the Dreadnought escapes on his own during the chaos of battle, managing through some combination of cunning and luck to break free of his captors. Perhaps he is destroyed, either by Ork experimentation gone wrong, or by his own hand through the reactor sabotage protocols, choosing death with honor over continued captivity. Or perhaps, in the darkest timeline, he is forced to fight. Perhaps the Orks succeed in compelling him to take arms against Imperial forces, creating a situation where a loyal space marine must choose between betraying his oaths or accepting destruction. This choice, should it come, would be the ultimate test of his character and convictions. Would he fight to preserve his existence, telling himself that survival creates opportunities for future redemption? Or would he refuse and accept death as the only honorable response to an impossible situation? The broader implications of this scenario extend beyond one marine's suffering. It speaks to the nature of the Imperium itself, a civilization so vast and so embattled that even its greatest heroes can disappear into the dark spaces between stars and be forgotten. The Dreadnought pilot served for centuries, earned the right to rest, and was instead preserved in what was meant to be an honor, but became a curse. How many others share this fate? How many ancient warriors sleep in forgotten vaults, waiting for awakenings that may never come, or that may bring them to situations as terrible as this? It also highlights the vulnerability of the Imperium's technology. The Dreadnought is a sacred machine, a relic that should be protected at all costs. Yet it fell into enemy hands through simple bad luck and the fog of war. How many other irreplaceable artifacts have been lost this way? How many pieces of ancient technology now serve the enemies of humanity, turned against their original purpose by the ignorance or malice of those who captured them? The thought is sobering and speaks to the slow decline of Imperial technological capability across the millennia. For you, the viewers of this channel, this story serves as a window into the depths of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It is not a story of glorious battles or triumphant victories. It is a story of suffering and endurance, of a warrior confronting a fate worse than death and finding within himself the strength to continue existing despite every reason to give up. It is the kind of story that makes the setting so compelling. The recognition that behind every statistic and every battle report, there are individual consciousnesses experiencing the full weight of their circumstances. The Alpha Legion Dreadnought story also reminds us that the line between hero and victim is often thinner than we might like to believe. This Marine is both simultaneously a hero for his service and sacrifice, a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He did not choose to fall into Ork hands. He did not choose to sleep for 2,000 years. He did not even choose to be interred in a Dreadnought in the first place. That decision was made by others who judged his value to the chapter to be worth the curse of continued existence. And yet he endures, because that is what warriors do, because surrender is not an option even when hope seems impossible. In the end, this story is about what it means to be human in an inhuman universe. The Dreadnought pilot has been stripped of almost everything that made him human in the conventional sense. His body is gone, replaced by machine. His mortal connections are severed, his battle brothers dead or scattered across time. His identity is obscured beneath Ork modifications and fading memories. And yet consciousness persists, awareness continues, and with it the capacity to think and feel and hope. That persistence, that stubborn refusal to cease existing even when existence brings only suffering, is perhaps the most human quality of all. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the more disturbing possibilities within the Warhammer 40,000 universe, please consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the lore of this setting from every angle, examining not just the big battles and famous characters, but also the smaller stories, the individual tragedies, the moments of horror and heroism that make this universe so rich and compelling. Like this video if you found it interesting, and share it with others who might appreciate this style of narrative exploration. The grim darkness of the far future contains multitudes, and we are here to explore them all, one story at a time. The Alpha Legion Dreadnought's tale is just one thread in the vast web of stories that make up this setting. There are thousands more, waiting to be told, waiting to be examined in the detail they deserve. Some will inspire, some will horrify. Some will challenge our understanding of heroism and duty and sacrifice. All will illuminate the terrible beauty of a universe where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods. Thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe, like, and share. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also stories worth telling about those who fight in that war and the prices they pay for their service. Until next time, Hydra Dominatus, and may the Emperor protect.